I'm Carole Taylor. On this episode of Journal, we try to understand the complexity of our interprovincial trade barriers. You know, those famous barriers everyone's now talking about? One man who knows something about this is Colin Hansen, one of BC's most accomplished politicians. In Gordon Campbell's governments, he served as Minister of Health, Finance Minister, Minister of Economic Development, Minister responsible for the Asia Pacific and the Olympics, and back to finance after I left, and then was named Deputy Premier. One of his most challenging assignments was to tackle the interprovincial trade barriers between BC and Alberta. Today, we've got the Prime Minister, most premiers, and many business people responding to Trump's ever-changing tariff threats by recognizing it's sometimes harder to trade with our own provinces than it is to do business with the states. Thus, the renewed call for free trade within Canada. Sounds good, I'm all for it, but it is not easy. I watched Colin Hansen struggle in 2006 trying to get a free trade agreement with just one province, Alberta. Why can't our doctors, nurses, engineers automatically have their credentials accepted in every province? Whose standards for food safety or environmental requirements will be accepted? I remember during Colin Hansen's negotiations, there was a moment when we ran into a roadblock, literally, all over the size of truck tires, different in each province. So I applaud the words that are being used. It is the right thing to do. But turning those words into action will not be quick. Every province will have their own list of non-negotiables. The Honourable Colin Hansen joins me after the break to talk about what these negotiations will look like behind the scenes. So pleased to be able to speak to Colin Hansen about these interprovincial trade barriers. So, Colin, it was your assignment at one point to do this kind of negotiating with Alberta. So is it just you wave a wand and poof, it's everything's okay?
Well, I think ministers often take credit for a lot of the things that happen in government. In reality, it's the incredible hard work that's done by public servants. And in British Columbia, from my 17 years in the legislature, 10 of those in cabinet, I never cease to be amazed by the incredible talent that we have in our public service working for the taxpayers of British Columbia. So that's where the real hard work did happen. But there were times when the minister had to play a pretty strategic role in some of those discussions.
And I think what I'm trying to get at is the fact that people are thinking this is simple. So all you need is a premier or a prime minister to say, okay, no more barriers, and they go away.
Yeah.
But I remember some of the reports you would do back to cabinet about what was going on in the negotiations. It is so much more complicated.
Well, it's interesting. I think when you say, should we eliminate these barriers that don't make any sense? And I think a lot, politicians across the country will say, of course. And all you, British Columbia, have to do is just match what we are already doing in our province. And it's kind of like, well, no, that's not quite how it works. And, it's just a part of the history of interprovincial commerce in Canada. 1995 was when we had the agreement on internal trade. And all provinces signed on to it. But it was what they called a positive list. It was a list of things that were free to trade. And so the later models, including the ones that we negotiated, were a negative list saying, these are the only exceptions. Everything else is open for free trade or free commerce. And the other thing with the agreement on internal trade is it had no meaningful dispute resolution. To give an example, shortly after the AIT was signed, Saskatchewan gave a massive subsidy to a company to relocate its meat packaging plant from British Columbia to Saskatchewan. Total violation of the agreement on internal trade. Consequences? None. So the subsequent negotiations that we had and subsequent agreements, we pushed for, first of all, more teeth, and secondly, things that were more meaningful and being more impactful.
And there's so many, when you talk about it this way, there's so many details. And I do remember the truck tires.
Yep.
Like truck tires, you say, we're talking about interprovincial trade. What's that got to do with a truck tire?
Well, it's trucking is a big. There's been lots of progress made, but there's still a ways to go. So, in some provinces would regulate certain restrictions or requirements for truck tires. The next neighboring province would have a totally different requirement. So the trucking companies have a choice. They can either drive illegally in the other province, or they stop at the border and change all their tires, which is not practical, of course. But just some of the other examples, I remember there was a summer that we had a devastating drought, and the agriculture community was just short of hay. And so we had to import hay from other provinces. And Alberta and Saskatchewan were pleased to oblige to supply hay. But when the trucks, there was a different requirement for stacking the hay on the trucks in BC than there was in Alberta. So the truckers literally, I heard in one case, were told that they had to unload the hay and restack it to comply with BC regulations. Now, a lot of those things have been dealt with over the years, but there's still some around. I'm told that there's still a difference, for example, between BC and Alberta for overweight or loads that are too wide or beyond width. So in British Columbia, some of those trucks can only travel at night. In Alberta, they can only travel in the daytime. So often the trucks apparently have to sit and wait at the BC-Alberta border for the sun to rise in order to carry on with their load. So those are the things that I think don't make any sense and need to be dealt with.
So when you were going through the negotiations at that time, what would you say was the hardest nut to crack?
Well, those are the ones that have never been cracked. Supply management, for example, is probably one of the biggest current barriers for interprovincial trade.
Give it supply management, how?
Well, because you wind up with production limits that are province by province. So if somebody has eggs from British Columbia, it's very difficult to sell those eggs into Alberta and vice versa. But that's one of the sacred cows in Canadian politics is supply management.
I always think of supply management just Quebec.
Well, it's the marketing boards.
And so we have that too here, huh?
It would be very difficult for any government to move past that in Canada today. It would be a huge political storm. And I think, the other thing is, people say, well, of course we've got to get rid of all of these terrible regulations that cost the consumer more money. And then you sort of say, well, give me an example. And people are, well, I don't know, I've just heard it's a big problem. But it's coming down to the specific examples, I think, that are the challenge. It's like when we went through the deregulation, we said we wanted to eliminate unnecessary red tape in British Columbia. And, people would, I'd have people that would stop me and sort of say, we got to do more to get rid of red tape. Well, give me an example. And they can't. So it's a challenge for governments. And I think the current environment with the push by all provinces and the federal government to reduce interprovincial barriers is good, because at least it focuses attention on the problem. And I think a lot of this has to be resolved by face-to-face negotiation from province to province to come up with ways to eliminate some of these costly and expensive barriers.
So in your negotiations, were you dealing with accreditation issues and doctors and engineers being able to move back forward?
Yes.
And?
Well, in terms of the big agreement that I had the honor of signing on behalf of British Columbia was called TILMA, and that was the Trade, Investment, and Labor Mobility Agreement between BC and Alberta, just two provinces. And there were extensive negotiations that went into that, and a lot of that was around labor mobility that said that if a professional was accredited in one jurisdiction, they would not have to go through additional accreditation in the other jurisdiction. They still had to be registered. So if you wound up with a doctor that was accredited in Alberta, they would still have to register with the College of Physicians and Surgeons in British Columbia, but they didn't have to go through any additional testing and things. But some of that still exists. Like licensed practical nurses, a lot of provinces don't recognize a nurse from another province, which is sad because every province is in need of nurses. And the more I heard, there was a case from a few years ago, a licensed practical nurse that I know moved from BC to Ontario, and it took her over a year to get her credentials recognized in that province. Meanwhile, Ontario was short of nurses. But just another one specifically to your question, after we got the agreement in place for labor mobility, I had one professional organization that came to see me in my office in Victoria and said, totally agree with us, totally understand why we're doing this labor mobility, but we just got this one little issue that the professionals in Alberta didn't have this one component of their requirements before they could get their licensing. And in British Columbia, they had this additional one. And it was, he said, we're fine with everything else, but we're just going to be looking for that. And I said, no. I said, look, I traveled to Alberta, and I want to make sure that the professionals that have overseen this particular field of industry are competent. And if you think that the only way they're competent is if they have the BC system, then we have a problem. So you need to sit down and talk to your counterparts in Alberta and sort this out, which is what happened.
As you can see, this is a complicated issue. We're going to take a break and continue. Back with the Honourable Colin Hansen. And we were talking about TILMA, which you were the signer off on, but you were negotiating that one. Does it have standing today? There was that one and the New West Partnership, which brought together the 4 Western provinces. Do we have something that you would call free trade with the 4?
Yes. So TILMA was put in place in 2008, came into effect in 2009 between BC and Alberta. But those negotiations were deliberately done to make it easy for other provinces to sign on to it. And sure enough, I think it was a year later, Saskatchewan signed on, and that was when it was renamed the New West Partnership. And then I think it was in 2017, Manitoba signed on. So if you look at the studies that are done today of interprovincial trade in Canada as a whole, those 4 provinces, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, are the jurisdictions that have the fewest interprovincial barriers. Provinces, Quebec has the highest, and I think the Atlantic provinces also have very high levels of interprovincial barriers, which they're working on, and they've now, I think, just in these last couple of months have shown a determination to resolve some of those things. But yeah, I think BC has a lot to be proud of in terms of the leadership that it has shown over the years on interprovincial economics.
I just sit back with some amusement when you see major politicians across the country, new prime minister, saying, oh, we're just going to get rid of trade barriers, because knowing your experience and how difficult it was just initially with one province, what would your advice be? Is it that everybody does one-offs? Because I know in the Maritimes, 2 of the provinces say, well, let's just do a regional. The 3rd province says, no, we only want to do a Canada. Like, how do you work this out?
So I think that on some of the more difficult files, the answer is mutual recognition. So it's 2 provinces or a group of provinces saying, okay, we're going to, if you authorize something in your jurisdiction, we will recognize that. And it has to be mutual, obviously. So rather than trying to get to a place where you've got, 14 jurisdictions, including the federal government, of course, all coming to consensus, instead just do what BC and Alberta did. Let's get sorted out between the 2 provinces and then let it grow from there. So I think that would allow faster movement on some of the critical issues. But one example, the province that as I said earlier, that has some of the highest level of interprovincial barriers is Quebec, and a lot of it comes down to language laws. Well, language laws in Quebec are not going anywhere, so you might as well hold your breath. But that doesn't mean that the other provinces can't make some progress on things like packaging. And another area that's not going to disappear is mobility for lawyers, because of course Quebec has a civil law system. We have common law in the other 9 provinces. So there's some things that would be very difficult to challenge.
The federal government, and I've noticed that Mark Carney, even when he was just becoming the leader of the Liberal Party, was saying, we're going to take the exceptions down to 0. So first of all, explain what the federal exceptions are.
Well, under the Canada, what used to be the AIT, the Agreement on Internal Trade, was renegotiated, and it was now renamed the Canada Free Trade Agreement. I think it was 2017 that happened, and they put in some teeth actually in the agreement, so that there were consequences for violations. So every and again, it's a negative list. So everything is subject to free trade interprovincially unless the province or the jurisdiction specifies it as an exception. BC and Alberta have the lowest number of exceptions, but we still have some that we need to work on.
Like natural resources?
Yeah, it's, one is water, for example, and that's a common one. Interprovincial movement of water is one of the exceptions that gets carved out by jurisdictions. But the federal government had, I think it was 30, almost 40 exceptions, and they've eliminated more than half of them so far, and they're looking at the others. But it's, a lot of this becomes the low-hanging fruit has already been picked. Like this whole discussion about interprovincial trade, like a lot of the commentary today is people sort of, where did this come from? Like, why didn't anybody deal with this before? Well, it has been dealt with substantially, and the low-hanging fruit has been picked. So now this renewed interest sort of ignores the fact that a lot of work has already happened over the last 25 years, but there's more work to be done.
So to get an exception, did each province just give the federal government the ones they wanted?
Yes.
So you could make quite a mighty list from every province.
Yes.
Well, you can't touch my water, or you can't touch this or that.
But to put an exception in there, they have to defend why they need the exception. It's not just plucking things out of the air for political reasons.
So if the federal government then takes the exceptions down to 0, and that doesn't immediately mean we've got free trade, because the provinces still have to decide to negotiate. Isn't that correct?
Well, with the federal government, what used to be 37 exceptions, those are the federal government's list. Every province has their own list in addition to that. And like Alberta has been working at reducing their list of exceptions. BC, I'm told there's work being done, but I don't believe they've eliminated any of the exceptions from the BC list. So now hopefully there's more of a political will to get on with that task.
I'm trying to see what the sequential steps are. So is that the first step? You work on the exceptions list and then you get down to negotiating, or?
Well, I think some of it, you take things like trucking, those come down to negotiations between provinces, and everybody's developed their own regulations because they made sense at the time in that jurisdiction. Nobody ever paid much heed to what was happening in the neighboring provinces until now. But I think that is a trend that's happening within government, is more and more provincial governments, as they introduce regulations or change regulations, are being told that they have to consider what's happening in other jurisdictions to achieve harmonization to the extent possible.
Told by whom? The federal government?
It's actually being led, one of the offices that's providing a lot of the leadership in this is based in Victoria. So the New West Partnership Agreement, the head office that's not what they call it, but it's based out of Victoria, and it looks at compliance. It It administers complaints. We'll set up adjudication panels if there's an alleged violation. So it's not all being driven by the federal government. And I think there would be resistance from a lot of the provinces if the federal government thought this was totally their bailiwick.
You know, people sit back and they go, oh my God, just listening to this and all the little bits and pieces that are not yet working. For instance, how come it's easier for the United States and Europe to get beer and wine onto the liquor stores across Canada than it is for individual provinces to do that?
And it all comes down to the various liquor control boards across Canada want to collect their taxes. And but there's ways around that. You know, like if you're a business in British Columbia selling T-shirts to Ontario, the business in BC has to collect the sales tax and remit it to Ontario. So there's no reason why that same principle couldn't apply to alcohol. It's just alcohol in Canadian politics has been just sort of one of those bugbears that goes back a century.
Well, I have to say, I really admired you at the time doing that work because it was really hard negotiations on little tiny bits and pieces and you couldn't lose concentration. So thank you for making a start. I'm not sure where we're going, but we'll keep our fingers crossed. But thank you for talking about this today.
My pleasure.
Colin Hansen, back in a moment. It is a good thing that most of our politicians are singing from the same song sheet. Interprovincial trade barriers must go. But what we now need is action. With a new Prime Minister and our country facing erratic and punishing tariffs from the United States, there may never again be such an opportunity for success. We'll see. Let me know your thoughts on YouTube. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.